We are very lucky to have with us today one of the most extraordinary historians of her generation, Maya Jasanoff, who is not just an extraordinary researcher and academic, but also a beautiful writer. And the two, as I'm sure you know, don't often, those two Venn diagrams cross but rarely. Maya had very little option about what she was going to do in life. Both her parents are full Harvard professors, as she now is. The black sheep of the family is her brother, who teaches at MIT down the road and over the river. Over the river or same side of the river? Yeah. But a significant half a mile.
2 subway stops away.
2 subway stops, exactly. Yeah. I mean, not at all the same thing. Maya is also, as well as a rare historian who can write, is a rare historian who doesn't sit in a small, closely guarded castle fortified around her PhD, and which she maintains resolutely for the rest of her career. Maya's interests have ranged globally and across the centuries. Each one of her 3 remarkable prize-winning books are set in different continents. The first, Edge of Empire, is between Egypt, India, and the wider reaches of the British Empire, and concerns the collectors who brought cultures and materials back and who created new conjunctions of thought and ideas and paintings, particularly in Egypt and in India. Her second book, which was won a raft of prizes, it concerns the fate of the loyalists who lost at the American Revolution and the many diverse worlds which they emigrated to. A story of the losers, exactly the sort of people who normally escape from the net of the historians, who in general tend to concentrate on life's winners, and the victors, who are the people who get to write history. And now we have a completely different sort of book that is set in a different continent altogether, this time in largely in Europe, but with little ripples into Africa and beyond. This time it's not even necessarily a history book. It's somewhere between biography, a literary criticism, and a travel book, a hybrid form for a hybrid writer. And she has stumbled on a wonderful subject. Joseph Conrad, a man. we have a fan base in the audience here. It's like very good. And one of the interesting things I think, which we will discuss maybe towards the end of this, is how far Conrad is not, in fact, currently top of the pops, particularly in academia. And the hero who foresaw the 20th century in the eyes of T.S. Eliot, and whose Mr. Kurtz finds his way into the wasteland, has since fallen foul of Chinua Achebe, and is regarded as rather a bleak and outdated and outmoded figure by many post-colonial writers, particularly those of African origin. And the words "Heart of Darkness" is something that sort of chills all African literary critics, and has given Maya a rougher ride than usual in some quarters on some aspects of this book. So one of the wonders of this book is that with most literary biographies, you start off inevitably with a rather dull beginning as the future hero of pen and quill sort of works his way through nursery school and encounters various maiden aunts and things, or sort of dodgy headmasters in the case of English literary biographies. Conrad, you go straight into 5th gear, and Maya's first chapter opens in this, certainly to me, very unfamiliar world of occupied Poland, where many leading intellectuals and writers have been rounded up by secret police and placed in a citadel under guard. In this extraordinary, oppressed, occupied land where writers cannot write and where the words freedom are not allowed, is the immediate background into which Conrad is born. Do you want to open by explaining a little bit more of that the crushed Poland into which Conrad had his origins.
So let me just first say that one of the great pleasures of being in conversation with Willie Dalrymple, as you will see, is that I don't actually have to talk very much.
He comes back every time, though.
William is a wonderful friend and colleague and inspiration for me and a champion of my work. And so we now have this great routine of William explaining to audiences what my work is about and then me moderating all the sessions at his festivals.
We've only got our own 4 sessions today. She's got on quite lightly.
But it's always a great pleasure to talk with you about these things because, as I'm sure many of you in the audience know, William himself crosses many of these lines between travel writing and history. And one of the things that I think I learned and took away from your travel writing, among others, because we met as you were on the cusp between writing travel books and writing history, is that there's something very much in common to these two genres, which is that they're both about following a kind of line through time and through lives. And that is really what I've tried to do with this book on Conrad. And as you say, it's a line that really, for the case of Conrad, starts in an extremely unexpected place for a writer who would come to be known as one of the great voices of modern with a capital M, English language literature. It starts in the kind of heartland of present-day Ukraine, where Conrad was born in 1857 to Polish parents in the Russian Empire. It's a time when the Polish nation doesn't exist on the map, having been carved out of existence by the empires of Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Prussia. And Conrad is raised in an environment of intense romantic and literary Polish nationalism, as his parents rear him on a kind of Polish nationalist literary tradition in the verses of poets such as Adam Mickiewicz, with the vision that his life should be dedicated to the bringing back of an independent Polish state from under the jackboot of the Russian Tsar. And it's out of this environment, this very sort of fervid literary and political environment that Conrad's kind of entry, I think, into what will be a life of writing and on the borders of empires comes into being. As Willie already indicated, he goes, he's an only child. His parents are, again, involved in this literary nationalist movement. His father moves the family to Warsaw when Conrad is just about nearly 4 years old. And the father is going to be putting out an underground newspaper whose goal is to rally support for a would-be rebellion against the Russian authorities in Warsaw. And he meets in cafes with people, and he kind of collaborates on various kinds of efforts to organize the resistance. The newspaper is coming together, et cetera, et cetera. But a couple of weeks before the first edition can come off the press, there's a rap on the door in the night, and the Conrad parents open the door to find the Russian troops at the door ready to arrest Conrad's father, Apollo Korzeniowski. So they march him off to the prison, and Conrad will later say that his first... Yes, Pavilion 10 in the Warsaw Citadel. And Conrad will later say that it was in the courtyard of this citadel, like as for many people of my nation, that my first memories were forged. So the family gets sent off into exile, and he spends the first kind of 10, 11 years of his life basically with his parents in these conditions of incredible hardship and exile for them, which turns into, for both the parents, really a death sentence, as they both end up contracting tuberculosis in conditions of great exposure to the elements and the climate and great kind of emotional hardship as well. And Conrad is orphaned by the age of 11. And he will later go on. As he gets to be a teenager, he's orphaned. His parents have left him basically nothing except for this linguistic heritage of nationalism. And he has this maternal uncle who ends up being his kind of guardian. And the maternal uncle says, enough of the nationalism, enough of the literature, enough of the romantic legacy of your parents. You should be, a bookkeeper, an accountant, or an estate manager, or something like that. So, like many a teenage boy, Conrad is not terribly keen on this. He has a different idea for himself. himself. And his idea for himself is, of course, as is only natural for someone who has grown up in the heartland of a landlocked nation, to become a sailor. And so he ends up going off at the age of 16 with his uncle's reluctant blessing to train to be a sailor in Marseille. And I think we can kind of understand this move, you know, as the great escape, the great escapist gesture for somebody who wants to get away from all of the things that he was raised with. But I think we can also see it as the act of somebody who was, in many ways, adrift before he ever set foot on a ship.
And in Marseille, he begins to pick up the world of the sea and the vocabulary of cables and knots and what wonderful words, the dog watch and...
yeah, I mean, he enters into... I think the amazing thing about Conrad, who, by the way, will go on to spend 20 years as a professional sailor. This is a guy who, up until this point, he doesn't speak a word of English, and he hasn't written anything that we know of, and he won't for another 20, 30 years, you know, so it's there's time for second and third acts for all of us. In the story of Conrad, we see a good example of that. So I think the wonder is less that he went to sea at all, but that he stayed with it. And I think his uncle probably had hoped that he would go off on this first voyage and then discover, you know what, it's actually a pretty, you know, difficult life. There's the hard work. You can get sick, you know, seasick, etc. But Conrad actually sticks with it. And for the next, for 4 years, he will continue to sail out of Marseille. He goes there because he speaks, like many members of his social class, he speaks fluent French. There's a Polish diaspora in Marseille at that time. This is the 1870s. But he runs into a couple of problems. One of them is that he, as a Pole, he is, in his case, a Russian subject. And in order to sail on French ships, he's supposed to get permission from the Russian authorities to do it. The French require that. But he's this young man of military service age, and the Russians are not keen to let him do it. And so he starts to run into trouble with the Marseille port authorities about getting new jobs. And then the other problem that he has is that he turns out to be really quite a spendthrift. And it's a little bit mysterious because he actually, as his uncle will later say, you know, he doesn't have a taste for I mean, he's not a drunkard. You know, forget about the drunken sailor in Conrad's case.
Doesn't obviously like women at this point.
He doesn't seem to have much of a thing for women, at least as far as we can tell. He doesn't gamble, and he ends up, but he ends up constantly running out of money and getting into trouble. So this all sort of comes to a head for him when he can't get a ship. He's running out of money. He borrows money from a friend of his, goes off to Monte Carlo in the hopes that he will make it back in the casinos, but he's not a gambler.
Surprise, surprise,
yes,
he loses
so
everything.
he ends up losing everything. So he comes back to Marseille, invites his friend to tea because he's going to reveal to the friend that he's lost all the friend's money. And before the friend arrives, Conrad pulls a gun out of his desk, points it at his chest, and pulls the trigger.
But misses, luckily.
But misses. Well, he doesn't miss. I mean, he hits something. He just doesn't hit his heart. And so it's enough for a telegram to go off to the maternal uncle who's at an agricultural fair off in Ukraine to say, you know, come quickly, Conrad is wounded. The uncle comes rushing across to Marseille, and they have a real kind of powwow about what to do for Conrad's future. And it is in the wake of this incident, a suicide attempt, obviously, that Conrad ends up joining the first of what will be many English ships. And I think it is no coincidence that the kind of next great reinvention of his life, which is to become an English sailor and to learn the English language, happens in the wake of this kind of catastrophic psychological moment in his early life.
One of the great pleasures of reading Meyer's book is these bravura descriptions of first of all, the port of Marseille, and then a fantastic description of early Victorian London. And the surprise, certainly for me, who professionally specializes in the oppression of various parts of the world by the British at this period, is that in London itself, it's a surprisingly open place, and that people from many different nationalities and different ends of the British imperial spectrum, and then also other places completely outside the British experience, Russia and Central Europe, find a home there. It is a world oddly untouched by fears of foreigners and worries about immigration.
It's one of the great paradoxes of British imperial history that this entity, which was, of course, the great global hegemon throughout the 19th century, was also, within the European context, the most liberal nation in terms of having some kind of representative democracy, in terms of not having a police state of the form you would have found in contemporary France, of having habeas corpus, of having freedom of speech. It is, of course, a juxtaposition or a set of ironies that anyone who's a citizen of the 21st century United States will also recognize. And so when Conrad goes to London, he goes to the capital of a nation that has the most open borders, well, it has among the most open borders in Europe. You don't need to carry papers around with you to show where you're from. The merchant marine that he enters and in which he will rise up through the ranks through a very well-established exam system that is genuinely open to talent. If you can study for the exam and pass it, you get to the next rank. He enters this world in which, you know, immigration restrictions and employment restrictions and so forth are just not really a factor. And within it, he discovers in the neighborhoods of London that he frequents a lot of other continental Europeans who are coming there to find work. Lots of Germans in London at this time, lots of Italians in London at this time, making their mark on neighborhoods that to this day have some imprint of that, such as Soho in London. And he will work in an environment on board ships in which 30 to 50% of his fellow sailors are actually from other parts of Europe. And it's just this is, I think, important for us to think about as we think about the relationship between liberty and oppression, or the lack of liberty in other places. And also, of course, in the context of what is now, of course, the acute problem of where Britain fits in Europe, it's worth noting that in the later 19th century, Britain was the place that Europeans, you know, whether it be Karl Marx or the people very much on other sides of the ideological spectrum, would go to be able to express their ideas freely.
Mm-hmm. And so Karl Marx is sitting at this point in the British Library, thundering away on his desk.
Exactly. And the deposed Emperor of France, Napoleon III, will end up going to Britain as well. I mean, it's a haven for all kinds of political exiles.
And this world of small minorities living in back streets, collecting together, plotting together, is one that he draws on later in life in The Secret Agent.
Yes. So what Conrad sees is, again, lots of Europeans living in London, and he's also aware, partly because of his own background in this kind of environment of underground radicalism in the Russian Empire, he's aware of analogous kinds of networks that are operating within Britain itself. And over the course of the last couple of decades of the 19th century, what had been this very liberal, sort of proudly liberal environment starts to change its contours a little bit. Again, something that will be very familiar to us today. First of all, there is a large number of immigrants who are coming from the Russian Empire who are Jewish. And the large numbers of Eastern European Jews pushed west by the pogroms are sort of obviously different, poor. There are fears of them kind of overrunning the East End and changing the complexion of this city in ways that create a kind of nativist backlash. And there's also a set of fears which come with the sense that some of these people are bringing political ideas that might be unsavory. And in particular, there's concern about Irish terrorism and about anarchist terrorism. And Conrad himself is never a part of these networks, but what he is able to see, I think, perhaps partly because he is an immigrant himself, are the ways in which the fears about certain kinds of political forces in the world get attached to foreign populations that may have nothing to do with it at all. I mean, the Eastern European Jews have nothing to do with the dynamite bombing campaigns of Irish terrorists, and yet these get fused. It's maybe worth saying a little about this, because this is a world where, for the first time, bombs are going off in capital cities. Yes, so this is a time when, among other things, dynamite is invented and used as a tool of political expression in the form of terrorism. So you have a slew of assassinations and explosions across continental Europe, chiefly perpetrated by anarchists, of course here in the US as well with the Haymarket incident. But in Britain, you see it mostly in the hands of Irish terrorists, who are the beginnings of what will go on, of course, to be a long tradition of Irish nationalist terrorism. And so Conrad is able to see that this kind of panic about terrorism is attached then to a panic about immigration. And he is, in this way, I think, the first person to really put his finger on a tension that is very familiar to us today.
And this is one of the main themes really running through the book, isn't it? The way that Conrad is the forerunner in so many ways. The first writer to write about so many concerns which we think are of our time. Globalization, changes in technology, leading to whole sections of the population being unemployed, immigration, terrorism, and imperialism and post-colonialism. These are all things that we think of as the issues of our time, but Conrad is writing about them in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s.
Exactly. This was the great surprise to me entering this book. I thought I was going to be writing a book about imperialism at its height, when European empires covered the vast majority of the territory of the world, and the British Empire in particular, a whole 20% of the world at this time. But what I discovered was that writing about imperialism in this time was also writing about globalization, as we would call it today, because this was a period when there was a real step change in the scale and range of long-distance communications with the telegraph. It was the first time that news, for example, could travel faster than the people who carried it with the telegraph. It was a moment when financial integration was happening on a scale that would not be matched again until the 1980s. It was a time when mass migration changed the face, really, of not only the Americas in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but also vast parts of Asia, where you have enormous amounts of migration around the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean, the Bay of Bengal. And in all of these ways, Conrad was witnessing things that were remarkably like the world today, because he was seeing not just imperial expansion, but the sort of pushing of and crossing of boundaries by people and money and ideas and new technologies as well.
And Conrad himself comes across this problem of changing technologies when, as a sailor who's grown up on the world of sail and rigging and this whole world of clippers, he finds the steam engine and the steamship coming in and making him unemployable.
He does. So I mentioned he had a 20-year career as a sailor. It's a long time. He only starts publishing in his late 30s. And on the one hand, his career is this wonderful testament to the size, the scale, the opportunities of the British Merchant Marine. It is the largest merchant fleet in the world at that time. It's carrying something like 50% of world trade. And it's open to foreigners like him. He takes the exams. It's an amazing progress. This kid from Poland, Polish kid from Ukraine, becomes a certified British captain in the Merchant Marine, a British subject, a fluent speaker of English. And he does it on the tall ships, which are bringing wool and grain and cotton and all of these commodities around the world. But at the same time that he's this kind of poster child for the opportunities and the great sort of potential of the British Merchant Marine, he's also kind of a canary in a coal mine, because the industry that he's in is transforming rapidly as the steamship is becoming competitive with sail on these routes. And what Conrad sees in this change is not only one of the great kind of technological transitions, the age really of transition into fossil fuels that we're still living in today, but he sees it as something more than merely a change in technology. He sees it as a change in ways of life. And in the way that he writes, particularly later on, looking back, very nostalgically, I should say, on the age of sail, and very romantically, he comes to view the British sailing ship as the kind of model for the sort of society and community that he likes best. It's a community in which, as he puts it, all of these people might themselves be sort of, rough and ready scoundrels, that you might find not want to run into in a dark alley in Liverpool. But when there's a storm, they will pull together into the service of something bigger than themselves. They have a sense of solidarity. They have a sense of commitment to the work that they do. He calls it the craft. They have a sense of connection to something beyond their ken in the form, of course, of nature and its forces. And these are people who embody for him a set of ideals about honor and community that are, in his view, completely traduced by the age of steam. Because on a steamship, you don't need these guys above deck who have these careful skills that have been passed down from generation to generation to generation. You have guys under, below decks shoveling coal into boilers. They're basically like cogs in this, they're sort of proletarian cogs in this industrial machine. You don't have that kind of connection to nature. You don't have, in Conrad's kind of fictionalized rendering of this, you don't have that sense of sort of coming together in the service of something bigger. And when you read Conrad, if something is set on a steamship, you can be pretty sure that something is going to go wrong.
Meanwhile, in his own life, things are going wrong. He finds himself more or less unemployed, and he has to go to Belgium in order to find a ship to work on.
So for all that he's managed to become a captain and had great success in many ways in this career, he's also facing problems with employment. I mean, first of all, the advent of these steamships means that there are actually fewer ships because the steamships can carry more cargo, but on fewer ships. So, and you're going up the career pyramid, obviously every ship has only one captain. So he's in this tight labor market. He is a foreigner. I mean, he doesn't have connections to the big shipping magnates and kind of
He speaks with an accent.
He speaks with an accent. He has a name that is hard for people to pronounce, which he will gradually start sort of modifying. He's born, I should say, Joseph Theodor Conrad Korzeniowski. And you'll see over the course of kind of tracking his papers, I found this really interesting, through the later part of the 19th century, that he'll sort of modify the name from, different, the Korzeniowski ends up getting dropped out in favor of the Conrad, which is what everybody ends up calling him. So in these conditions of kind of basically a tighter and tighter labor market, I mean, imagine the guy who's the film developer who's looking for a job today in, the age of digital photography. He works, he finds work through all the connections that he's got, but the connections that he's got are a little bit distant, and they are, among other things, in French. He can use his ability to speak French. He has a relative in Belgium, and it is through, in part, the offices of this relative that he signs on to a very different kind of vessel from the ones he had been on before, and that is when he signs a 3-year contract to sail steamers up and down the Congo River in Central Africa.
And at this point, the King of Belgium has managed to pull off a fast one in Central Africa. He's created a new state, the Congo Free State, which is the very opposite of free. It's one of the most exploitative moments in the whole history of European exploitation through imperialism.
It's really, I mean, it's hard to think of a more kind of horrific example of hypocrisy and hegemony come together than the so-called Congo Free State. So in 1884, the European powers gather at Bismarck's behest in Berlin at the Conference of Berlin, and together they basically draw lines on the map of Africa, apportioning different parts of sub-Saharan Africa to each other. One of the largest chunks of Africa is held aside in the name of what will be ostensibly an independent state, the Congo Free State. It is nominally independent, although it is under the supervision of King Leopold of the Belgians. And it is nominally independent, free of European imperialism, at least in name, free, it is said, of slave labor, at least in name, and free to all kinds of powers to come in and have free trade, at least in name. And within practically moments, all of these things are totally traduced. When Conrad arrives he's there in 1890-91, it's very much toward the beginning of the kind of history of the Congo Free State as this political entity. The worst has not yet happened, but Conrad can already see in just one journey up and down the river some of the things that will go on to mark this regime. He sees that, contrary to the ideals of so-called civilization, which are going to be spread in these domains, the actual people, Europeans who are on the ground doing stuff, are incredibly kind of violent, mean-spirited, rapacious, selfish characters whom he doesn't like at all.
And he actually sees horrors. He sees corpses.
Yes, and then he
to,
sees that all of this talk of freedom is actually coming, it's talk, and what's actually happening is oppression. To give one example, the Congo River, when it enters into the Atlantic, it does not do so through a delta system in the way the Nile or the Mississippi or something does. It actually comes down through rapids, which means that if you're wanting to get onto the navigable part of the river, you have to hike up. At that time, you have to hike up the rapids for a couple hundred miles before you get to Kinshasa and then are able to sail on your boat, your steamer, in the way that Conrad does. Well, you go up the rapids, and what's happening, there are these teams of African porters who are carrying all of the stuff for the Europeans up and down the rapids. And where do they come from? They're conscripted, basically, from neighboring villages and forced into this kind of service. And this is all, at this time, in the service of an ivory trade, which is bringing ivory from way upriver, as it were, sort of halfway into the African continent, leaning in toward Eastern Africa. And where are they getting the ivory from? They're getting it in part from a bunch of Zanzibari Arabs who have set up a kind of trading empire in this part of Africa, which is also involved in trading slaves. So much for freedom. In other words, freedom means in Congo violence, extraction, and force.
And Conrad is deeply traumatized by this. This makes a huge impression on this man.
It does. I mean, he is, I should say, he's sort of morally repelled by what he sees, by the hypocrisy. And hypocrisy, a condemnation of hypocrisy will really be the kind of, I think, the core sort of moral strand in all of Conrad's work. He is physically very sick, and through much of his time there, as are many of the Europeans there, and he is psychologically deeply disturbed by what he sees. I mean, he's got what we would today diagnose as clinical depression, the suicide attempt, etc. And so after just one journey up and down the river, even though he's supposed to be there for 3 years, which is dozens of journeys, he ends up quitting in despair, sailing back to Europe, not knowing where he's going to get his money from, not having any prospects before him, but knowing that what he has seen is too much and that he doesn't want to be a part of what's going on there.
And at this period, he's just discovering himself as a writer. He has a novel on the go, which will become Maze Folly. And bits of this, I mean, many books come out of this journey, but the first is all sorts of ideas filter into Maze Folly.
So one of the most extraordinary things about Conrad, of course, he travels all over the world as a sailor, and what he sees will often be the foundation for some of his novels. And he, perhaps more than many other writers, is very keen to present examples of what he says are the real incidents, the real characters that underpin his fiction, which is why I was drawn to him as a historian, among other things. And the other thing that's interesting about it is that, of course, like all of us who travel through the world, we enter every new place that we go to with the sedimented experiences of where we have already been. So when Conrad goes to England, for example, he goes to England as the Polish subject of the Russian Empire, who sees England through those lenses. When he goes to Southeast Asia, a destination that he sails to a lot in his maritime career, he goes as the person who has now, come up through the ranks of the English merchant marine. When he goes to Africa, toward what will end up being the end of his sailing career, he goes up a river into the interior of a continent on a steamship, carrying with him the experiences of his earlier travels on a steamer up the estuaries of the rivers of Borneo, which is where he had first encountered a certain type of European trader in these kind of river estuary cosmopolitan sorts of communities that you see there. When he goes to Congo, he takes with him some blank notebooks in which he will end up writing the only diary that we know that he ever wrote, which, by the way, he keeps in English, which is a sign of sort of how he's already thinking. But he also brings with him the manuscript of what will become his first novel, which is Maze Folly. And the novel is set in one of these Borneo-type estuaries. It's concerning a European sort of washed-up trader who has married a Malay woman and is deeply concerned about the kind of racial politics of who his daughter will marry and so on and so forth. And I think it's really important for us to bear in mind that, you know, when we look at Conrad's journey in Congo and we think ahead to what he will end up writing about it, which is Heart of Darkness, it's worth bearing in mind that his worldview was one with a sort of, if you will, continental drift, where what he sees in Asia is inflecting what he sees in Africa. What he sees in Africa will inflect what he writes about Asia. He is a man who is able to kind of put together different experiences in quite remarkable ways.
But this is the moment that this man who spent so long as a sailor, who thinks of himself as a man of the sea, becomes instead a man of letters, and in a language which is not even his second language.
It's his third language, and it's just a remarkable thing. I mean, he started learning English at 21, so there's still hope, you know, for us in other languges, I guess.
When's your Hindi book coming out?
Yeah, that's right. I'm working on it. So he's writing in English, and he's writing at an extraordinary level. I mean, and you know, people will often ask, how did he do it? And I say, well, you know, I mean, he is an extraordinary writer. You know, there's a reason he's quite sort of exceptional, and it had to do in part with considerable talent. But I think it's
this final phase is sort of, again, not only is he moved from being a sailor in the peripheries of the world, exploring places that no other major writer in the English language has even visited.
Yes.
And one of the great surprises I always think of the British Empire in India is it actually produces so few good writers that you know, you have all these civil servants going out, but there's a few echoes in Jane Austen, a few echoes in Thackeray, a bit of E.M. Forster, a bit of early Kipling, but the reality is it actually produced very little. And yet here is Conrad, a foreigner, not an Englishman, who's the man who actually writes the great book on colonialism, and as you nicely put it in the book, the way power operates across continents and races.
Yes, well, I mean, I think that, so Conrad, I think, you know, he comes from a literary family and comes from a kind of literary tradition, and so we can see a kind of great arc in his life, in a sense. You know, coming from this literary tradition from Poland, and then leaving it, of course, moving into the English language, among other things.
Is his father still read in Poland? Is Apollo someone that you would come across?
Well, there may be people in the audience who can talk about this more. He is remembered, and he's remembered as a nationalist. He's buried in Krakow, yeah, he's remembered as a nationalist. There was actually, I think, some complication about the legacies of Apollo versus Conrad, who would later be seen, I mean, partly by his contemporaries and certainly by later people who saw him as a kind of traitor to the Polish language because he was writing in English. But I think he's a sort of tricky figure, and then he also has been seen as being sort of conservative with a small c.
So let's talk about this. I mean, my generation very much grew up with Conrad as the very cool novelist, who Apocalypse Now had been based on. We all sat huddling in front of all those helicopters going off to Ride of the Valkyries, and T.S. Eliot, the coolest of all cool 20th century dark novelists, writing in The Wasteland, quoting Kurtz and so on.
The Hollow Man.
Hollow Man.
Yeah.
And yet now he has a less warm reception in academia, as you found, I think slightly to your own surprise.
Well, I knew that Conrad was controversial. I mean, so just to kind of wrap up the thread about in a way, the Continental Drift, because I think it's relevant to this. So Conrad's through the 1890s, he publishes his first novel in 1894. He's in his late 30s, and he will publish a few more. You know, most of his best-known works actually, kind of in the late 1890s and early 1900s. And throughout the 1890s, he's sort of going back and forth between the idea of going back to sea and being a writer. But it's toward the end of this time, and in fact at the end of his kind of thinking about maybe going back to sea, that he will write the work that is best known based on his time in Congo, and it is, of course, Heart of Darkness, the novella that describes the journey of an English sea captain, Charles Marlowe, up and down a river in an unnamed region in an unnamed continent, but which we can easily analogize to Congo of the time. The book, however, it opens and closes on the Thames estuary. And Conrad makes a great play out of the idea that the Thames estuary, too, has been one of the dark places of the earth. And in the narrative, I think we can see the sort of genius move of the text, in a sense, is to take this story of a journey up and down a river in the unnamed place, in the unnamed continent, and to loop it back into England, and to say, this is your story too, that what happens there happens here, and vice versa. And I think that's, the important move. That said, Conrad, of course, was challenged. I mean, there's a famous essay by Chinua Achebe, many of you may be familiar with it, from the mid-'70s, in which Achebe pointed out very correctly that Conrad, doesn't even name Africa. He doesn't give voice to any African character in any kind of meaningful way. He traffics in the most kind of blatant racial stereotypes. He uses Africa, as Achebe puts it, as a kind of screen against which to project the breakdown of a single European's mind. And I think that critique is incredibly important, and I think it is. It was particularly important at that time when this novel was being read as this kind of archetype of kind of the great universalizing modern tradition. And yet, I think that we had a pendulum swing that maybe took us away from some of the other things that are, I think, really important about Conrad. Because for me, the takeaway is that we are all sort of, mixed up in these circles, and what does happen there, what happens there does happen here, and vice versa. And
only connect.
Only connect, yes. Yeah. And I think that the label that has, of course, followed Conrad ever since of being a racist has some. I mean, it is true in a certain literal sense, as it is true of just about every other major writer from that period. But I think that it has had the effect now of, in our current political climate as well, of making Conrad very much persona non grata. And I find it deeply ironic that the one person who actually had more to say than many, many, many of his contemporaries about border crossing and difference and the tensions around being an immigrant and operating in different languages and cosmopolitan milieu, that this one author who had more experience with that, more to say about it, and more insight into it than anyone else, is the one we don't read because we call him racist. And he was, but I think, so were many of the other novelists of that time, and all these things can coexist.
And yet, it's Kipling that's given the pass by Edward Said rather than Conrad.
Well, Kipling, of course, people just say, "Oh, he's a racist," but we wouldn't take him seriously anyway. I mean, of course, Conrad people do take seriously. But I mean, I guess my point in this is to say that I believe, at least very firmly, that many things can coexist, and Heart of Darkness is a great example of this. You can have a basically racist portrayal of Africa that coexists with a profound, meaningful, and important critique of imperialism. And I think that, I think it's very salient to read the critique, partly because I think that to this day, we see in a lot of the discussions about, responsibility to protect, for example, or humanitarian intervention, we see a lot of these discourses still swirling around today. And I think the best thing to come away from these kinds of discussions is to heighten our self-awareness and our self-consciousness about it, so that we can think more critically about how we're trying to put together different value systems.
We're out of time. But before we go to the audience, one last question. And just a general thing. For people who haven't read Conrad, just briefly, why should we bother today, and what should people start with? You write in your book that his world shimmers beneath the surface of our own. Is that the main reason we should be?
I think we should read him because I think that he can help us navigate the manifest moral complexities of living in a globalized world. I think it's very tempting, particularly in this very polarized political climate, to clutch onto what feel to us like certain lines of division and moral certainties. You believe that, I'm not going to talk to you. You're wrong. But I don't think that that is the way that most of us actually navigate through the world, and I think that it is a much poorer and more violent and dangerous world when we draw these sorts of lines. I think that Conrad is not, as it were, a model, but I don't know who is. I think that Conrad rather is a guide. I think that he can show us that when you are dealing with cultural collision, changing world powers, technological transformation, disruptive ideologies, it is actually really hard to draw the one line and say, that's it, that's not the line across which I'm going to speak or engage. And I think that it is very important for us today, you know, sitting in America, to be thinking in rich, complex terms about the challenges that we're facing.
And if there's one book you'd recommend to someone in the audience who's been interested in this discussion but hasn't read Conrad, is it The Heart of Darkness?
I mean, I do think Heart of Darkness is a great place to go. I mean, I think you should read Achebe's essay as well, and I think that reading Heart of Darkness is extremely important.
Short, apart from the
It's short, right. So if you feel like a longer challenge, I would suggest Nostromo, which is a novel set in a fictional South American republic.
And which is very long.
It's long and it's complicated, but it's extremely acute about, I think, the greatest continuity between Conrad's time and our own, which is the role of what he calls material interests, or what we would call maybe global multinational capitalism, as a disruptive force in world affairs. And then if you want to read something just kind of a little different and shorter, I would suggest also his story Typhoon, which is a wonderful kind of seafaring story about a ship carrying, in fact, Chinese migrant laborers back home.
My favorite as a teenager was Under Western Eyes, which is a novel you don't talk so much.
I don't talk too much about that. I mean, really, you can go to any of them and you'll find something fascinating, to something in there. So.
Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, please, a big round of applause for Maya Jasanoff.
We have 10 minutes of questions.
We still have 10 minutes for questions.
Questions.
So this gentleman's got his hand straight up, followed by the gentleman in the yellow T-shirt.
I'd like you all, by the way, to marvel at how unique it is that there are actually 10 minutes left for questions after the two of us have been going on.
Sorry.
I'm going to ask a question, but first, I just finished your book. I just wanted to let everyone here know it's very accessible to the general reader. Okay? And one thing I was intrigued by is he's so engaged by the issues of his time, yet in his biography I noticed he's kind of resistant to political advocacy, direct advocacy, both in his literature and in his private life. I was wondering if you could comment about that, since authors today seem so politically engaged.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think all authors are to the same extent, but we're, of course, aware of some, which was also true in Conrad's day. So Conrad was himself, yes, I mean, deeply interested in talking about power dynamics, but in his, he himself was extremely apolitical, much to the chagrin of many of his friends. I mean, he had friends who were pretty active socialists, among other things, and they would always try to rally him to support various causes, and he wouldn't. You know, I think that part of it is that he was deeply cynical about political ideologies based in part on his childhood experience. Part of it could also be that he was just sort of a passive person and a quietist. I do think that there are cases that we can look at now where we say, you know, he really didn't put his money where his mouth was in a few occasions, one of which would be the one that's usually cited is the Irish nationalist Roger Casement. Was somebody whom Conrad actually met in Congo in 1890 at a time when Roger Casement was not yet an Irish nationalist. He was working for the railroad company, and Conrad was not Conrad. He was Korzeniowski, you know, sailing the ship. But anyway, much later, Casement gets arrested for his Irish nationalist activities and sentenced to death, and various people get up petitions to try to seek clemency, and Conrad refuses. And there, he refuses for reasons that many people dislike him for, which is that he is an empire loyalist in a certain way. At the same time that he is a great critic of the abuse of imperial power, he is also an adoptive subject of the British Empire who thinks that Casement has been a traitor. So, you know, he's a complicated figure politically, and I disagree with him on some of these points, but I think he also just didn't feel like it was his job in a certain sense.
Yellow T-shirt.
Yes, about 3 years ago I pulled a book off my shelf that included The Secret Sharer, which I had taught, and I read again with great pleasure. And The Double, The Doppelganger, it was in the context of Jung's The Shadow. All of that made sense to me, but it was paired with The Nigger of the Narcissus. And I read for the first time The Nigger of the Narcissus. It has stayed with me, and I have no clue how to wrap my head around that story. Could you comment briefly?
2 lines, you know. I hope there's some students here who have an essay to write. Well, I mean, that work is typically, but which, by the way, speaking of racism, I mean, the title, when it was first published in the US, was published under the title The Children of the Sea, because the view was that the title couldn't work in the US.
Because America was more sensitive to racism?
Yeah, I mean,
more sensitive in which sense, though?
Well, that's a very good question. Yeah. Because, you know, obviously that was a time at which, you know, I mean, it was written in the late 1890s. I mean, I think that you know, the racial politics in the United States were very troubled at that time.
Even then,
you know,
yeah.
Of course, yeah. Post-Reconstruction. So I mean, that book is really, I think, the great love letter to the sailing community as Conrad idealizes it. It's the only work of his in which he kind of adopts the perspective of the men before the mast as opposed to the officers. And it's the one in which he makes the most explicit statements about that solidarity of the fellowship, and in which he develops, particularly at the end, this incredibly kind of, frankly, overwrought metaphor of Britain itself as a sailing ship kind of coming out of the waves. And I think it's a work in which you can see him trying to assert certain claims to, I think, belonging, and trying to celebrate all of those values, which he also folded in what is now probably the most famous thing about that work, which is the preface that he wrote for it, which is the closest thing to a kind of artistic manifesto that he ever wrote, in which you can see him likening the act of writing to the act of to the craft, to the act of sailing. And so I think for him, it was a moment when he was trying to draw together what he felt about sailing, about tradition, about the British nation, and about art.
What was your problem with it?
I think it's an extended meditation on solidarity and its fragility.
Sir.
Here we go. Like going in front of the speaker. Hey, sir. Thank you.
Thank you both. I want to thank Maya for giving me a new insight into Conrad, because I've read Heart of Darkness. I read Chinua Achebe's critique. I have not read your book, but I have read your response to the critiques of your book and the storm that kind of generated. Mm-hmm. So I'm very grateful for this new insight into the humanity of Joseph Conrad, because, like you said, it's necessary to see human beings as complete human beings and not just people you put in a box and you tick that box and you discredit that person or you embrace that person. So thank you for giving me this broader appreciation for Joseph Conrad as a human being. And I have to thank him too, because Apocalypse Now is still my all-time favorite movie.
Thank you very much. I mean, I might just add, as the microphone goes to the next questioner, that I mean, this moment has made me think, of course, more than ever about the importance of studying history and the past and thinking about ourselves in connection with what came before us, but also because that makes us more aware of what might come after us. And I think that one of the things that troubles me, I suppose, about the rush to judgment about figures in the past is that it makes it seem as if we're kind of off the hook and that we've advanced. And I think one of the things that Conrad is particularly acute on is that the discourse of progress often sort of, it's a language that's very compelling to people, but it's not necessarily evident to all people in all ways. And I think that it teaches us humility to look at the past and realize that, look, you know, I mean, people were trying to balance very competing objectives, and, you know, we are trying to do that too, and to think that we're somehow above that or beyond that, I think is foolhardy.
Can I ask how you got on with Heart of Darkness? Did you feel exactly like Achebe or not? Go, microphone back. Right. Sure. Right. Right.
Unfortunately, there's a lot to choose from. Yeah.
One last question for the back. Hand up here.
Back there.
This gentleman at the back. Oh.
And you have to make it quick. I'm the timekeeper.
Could you talk about Conrad's literary heirs? I mean, when I was taking literature, I heard Faulkner, but I'm curious what you think his line of thinking evolved into.
I mean, I think that the most obvious literary heir has just left us, and that is Naipaul. And I think that, I mean, there are many literary heirs who took direct inspiration from Conrad, who were his immediate sort of successors, Hemingway being one, Fitzgerald being another, Faulkner being another. Conrad has actually been very stimulating to writers outside of Britain. And in particular, I'm sorry? Graham Greene, yeah. And in particular, of course, to writers who are writing in languages other than their mother tongue. Naipaul, I think, was interested in Conrad and interested in many of the same themes, and even wrote, actually one of the things that got me first kind of thinking about this, a great couple of essays in the New York Review of Books in which he followed, he was traveling around the recently decolonized rim of the Caribbean, and he said, everywhere I went, it seemed that Conrad had been here before me. So I would say that Naipaul is the most kind of obvious heir today.
We're finished now.